Vancouver area. Before continuing, I would like to invite Carol to do a land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Furkan, and welcome everyone. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are fortunate to be able to hold this event on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Especially on this International Day of Peace, we reflect on the ongoing colonization of the land, which is anything but peaceful. We remember to be accountable to Indigenous people and thank those who still live on and care for the land. Please take a moment to reflect on the land history of the land you are on. Back to you, Furkan.
Thanks, Carol. The International Day of Peace is a United Nations sanctioned day observed annually on September 21st. It's dedicated to world peace and specifically the absence of war and violence. The day was first celebrated in 1981. In 2013, the day was dedicated by the Secretary General of the United Nations to peace education, a key preventative means to reduce war sustainably. To inaugurate the day, the United Nations Peace Bell is rung at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. The bell was a gift from the United Nations Association of Japan as a reminder of the human cost of war. The inscription on its side reads, "Long live absolute world peace." World Beyond War is a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. World Beyond War began in January 1st, 2014. We have chapters and affiliates around the world. We have members in 175 countries. We have 3 staff members in the US, 1 in the UK, and 2 in Canada, one of whom is the newly hired Canada coordinator for World Beyond War, Rachel Small. Also, we are currently working on attaining tax-deductible status in Canada. Our aim is to create awareness of popular support for ending war and to further develop that support. We work to advance the idea of not just preventing any particular war, but abolishing the entire institution of war. We strive to replace a culture of war with one of peace in which nonviolent means of conflict resolution take the place of war. Today's event was initiated by the Vancouver chapter of World Beyond War. We have several other chapters across Canada. There's the Victoria chapter led by Bill Geimer, the Toronto chapter led by Melissa Wheel, and the South Georgian Bay chapter led by Helen Peacock. There are also other chapters that may be forming soon. So if you want to get involved, reach out to your local chapter. And if there's not one in your area, you can certainly look into starting one. And there'll be a link that Rachel will post in the chat with more information on finding a local chapter or on creating a new one. Vancouver Peace Poppies was also involved in planning today's event, and you'll hear more about their work from Teresa Gagne later in the program. So if you've not already done so, please sign the Declaration of Peace. Again, Rachel will post the link to that in the chat. So signing the declaration will put you on our email list so you receive the latest information about World Beyond War activities and educational material. So we are now going to start with our first speaker, John Foster. He'll speak for 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. Feel free to put any questions into the chat anytime. Rachel Small, our new World Beyond War Canada coordinator, she will manage the Q&A session. John Foster is an energy economist with more than 40 years experience in policy and economic issues relating to infrastructure and petroleum. While holding positions with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, Petro-Canada and BP Group, he witnessed firsthand the impact of petroleum geopolitics in more than 30 countries around the world. His book, Oil and World Politics, The Real Story of Today's Conflict Zones, was published in 2018. Born in London, England, he graduated from Cambridge University and lives in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome, John. Looks like he's muted, Rachel.
John, you'll just have to unmute yourself and then start again.
There, how's that? Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Good. Fine. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint talk and see if I can get it up and running. There. How's that?
Perfect.
Good. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for those who I can't see who are listening. Quite different from speaking at in an auditorium where you can see everybody and you have to dodge the banana skins. As Foucault was saying, I'm a petroleum economist, and in my working life, I visited one country after another with a briefcase and a suitcase, and that's me on the left. I focused on the economics, not the politics. That was true of my colleagues as well. We really weren't thinking about the big picture. So how did I start thinking about war? Perhaps it was 9/11 itself. So having a little technical difficulty at this end. Yeah. So as a boy, as you gather, I lived in England, and I lived in England during the Blitz. And after that, I did obligatory naval service, and I was in a landing craft at Suez, that misbegotten invasion of Egypt, now in the history books. So I've experienced war to a certain extent. And today, I'd like to talk about three kinds of warfare. Military, that's pretty obvious, but also economic and also psychological warfare. So first of all, military warfare. And that was the White House's preferred approach under George Bush I and George Bush II, and under Obama as well. After 9/11, the Bush administration decided on Afghanistan and then Iraq. The half-truths and the fabrications were clear to see, and the misery the wars would cause was of little interest. I was appalled. So why was Afghanistan so important? Well, thinking as an economist, I looked at the natural resources. I unearthed a pipeline story, a gas pipeline planned from Turkmenistan, which is just to the north of Afghanistan, through Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. To Turkmenistan, which few people seem to have heard about, has the world's fourth largest reserves of natural gas. And I wrote an article about it. It's called A Pipeline Through a Troubled Land. And the CCPA, which is the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, published it. The Globe and Mail had a front page article, Pipeline Opens New Front in Afghan War. That was quite an experience. So this TAPI pipeline, TAPI stands for those four countries, still remains unbuilt. They've built their section in Turkmenistan, and it's about as far as it goes because of the war in Afghanistan. But the United States is still heartily promoting it. Meanwhile, the Chinese have built three huge gas pipelines from Turkmenistan to China, all the way to Shanghai. No war and no sanctions. Now, these conflicts kept multiplying, and I kept watching and digging. And I found, being a petroleum economist, petroleum stories in each war. Resources in Iraq and Libya and Iran and Venezuela, strategic pipelines or routes for them in Afghanistan, Syria and Ukraine. And then strategic sea routes, for example, near Somalia and Yemen, obviously the South China Sea. And all these countries are caught up in US rivalries with China and Russia. The reality is, oil is the most important commodity in world trade and is a source of enormous wealth. And since 9/11, oil has been part of one conflict after another. Oil and geopolitics are inseparable and rarely discussed openly. So I wrote this book, which we mentioned, Oil and World Politics, and created a website too, and I kept learning. After Afghanistan came the 2003 war on Iraq, and Canada fortunately stayed mostly on the sidelines. Iraq has the world's 5th largest oil reserves. Now, Washington sold the war on Iraq by alleging weapons of mass destruction. And as we know, the reality was there were none, and they knew it. President George W. Bush insisted the invasion was not about oil, but insiders now admit it was. Already in 2001, which is 2 years before the invasion, the State Department had created a working group to formulate a new oil policy for a post-war Iraq that would open the sector to foreign oil companies. And then came the 2011 war on Libya. And Libya has the world's 9th largest oil reserves. Its oil is top quality. President Gaddafi had used the oil wealth to Libyan advantage, providing healthcare and education for all. The NATO war was sold as the responsibility to protect R2P, but in fact it was regime change. And led by a Canadian general, NATO flew 9,700 strike sorties over 8 months, an awful lot. It devastated Libya's infrastructure. And 9 years later, today, oil exports are sporadic. Rival factions fight for power. Various countries support one faction or another. Refugees flee to Europe. Libya is a failed state. The year 2011 was also the start of the war in Syria. I can say much about that, I'll just say a little. The West, including Canada, imposed crippling sanctions. And the sanctions prevent Syria's oil exports, oil imports, and its stymied major pipeline plans. The sanctions are not endorsed by the United Nations. Today, the United States has troops in Syria's east, ostensibly to protect the Syrian Kurds, but in reality to protect the oil fields from supplying Syria. Trump has admitted as much about the protection. To my mind, it's modern piracy or piracy. My second point, I rather like this cartoon, relates to economic warfare. Sanctions or economic warfare appear to be Trump's preferred method. It looks bloodless, but it causes death and deprivation, and it doesn't work. The IMF, the World Bank, and its regional counterparts are part of the so-called Washington Consensus, which has imposed neoliberal policies on economies around the world. And that means things like utilities, taking them out of public hands, making them private. What this leads to is debt and austerity, and it ties countries to the Washington Consensus. As Washington sees it, international organizations, and I've worked for 2 of them, are tools to enforce US goals and power. And any country taking a contrary view is punished. For example, Iran and Venezuela. Now, Iran has the world's 4th largest oil reserves and the 2nd largest of gas. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, Canada's number 2. Oil is an economic weapon. Washington wants to shut down Venezuela's oil exports completely, and Iran's too. It's imposed crippling sanctions on anyone who attempts to trade with those countries. Again, the sanctions are not endorsed by the United Nations. The US alleges Iran is trying to make nuclear weapons. Countless inspections have found no evidence it's a manufactured crisis. Iran is a regional power and a challenge to US control of the Middle East. The US sanctions are unilateral. It's one thing for the US to sanction its own companies trading in a particular hit country, but the US applies them to foreign banks and companies worldwide. And it can only do this because it controls the global banking system to much of an extent. Could Canada get drawn in? Washington threatens Iran with war. Iran threatens to close the Persian Gulf if attacked. It's a tinderbox. Oh my goodness, we're all right. What's going on in Venezuela is also economic warfare and regime change. President Chavez survived a US-led coup in 2002, and Maduro survived an attempted assassination in 2018 and an attempted coup this year. Washington has imposed severe sanctions on Venezuela's oil and banking sectors. Now, Canada created the Lima Group and imposed sanctions too. The problem, they say, is democracy deficit, lack of democracy. And yet, Lima Group's Brazil and Honduras both have egregious democracy deficits. Canada is being selective, to put it politely. The Lima Group is a cherry-picked set of particular Latin American countries, plus Canada against Venezuela. Under the charters of the United Nations and the Organization of American States, no country may interfere in the internal affairs of another. Canada has signed both charters. It should not intervene with sanctions. Again, the sanctions on Venezuela are not endorsed by the United Nations nor the OAS. As a result of these sanctions, Venezuelan oil exports have tanked. They've gone down the tube. To Alberta and Canada's good fortune, US refineries have switched from Venezuelan heavy oil, for which they were much built, to oil sands bitumen. And Canadian officials overlook this reality in public comments. Iran and Venezuela have turned to China and Russia for support and protection. Washington regards China and Russia as its top rivals. US containment policies are much directed at petroleum, other sectors too, obviously. China is planning massive investments to link it with Europe by land and sea, and that's its Belt and Road Initiative. The US opposes the initiative, and it's pressuring countries worldwide to reject Chinese investment. The US seeks to bring down China's technological giant Huawei, and Canada is complicit. It seized Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou at Vancouver Airport. Imagine my dread at landing there. And usually the US fines companies, but this is a case where an executive was arrested. It's unique. Now, Russia has become China's largest source of oil and gas. Even so, China is heavily reliant on Middle East oil. Remember, China's the largest importer of oil worldwide. US warships patrol key waterways, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and it conducts freedom of navigation exercises, so-called offshore China. To my taste, the warships are provocative. Russia is a petrostate. It's the world's single largest exporter of oil and gas. Surprise, you might think of Saudi Arabia. And pipelines and sea routes to market are vital to its economy. It wants to sell its #1 resource, petroleum, that's the oil and gas, in Asia and in Europe. And Russia and China are strategic partners resisting US policies of containment. With fracking, the United States has recently become the world's largest oil producer, dramatically reducing its dependence on foreign sources. And it's become the world's largest gas producer, overtaking Russia. It wants to export liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe, displacing Russian exports. Washington calls it freedom gas. And Europe is a vital energy market for Russia. It's the world's second largest gas market after North America. In the Soviet era, its gas pipelines to Europe passed mostly through Ukraine. And today, Russia faces a hostile government in Ukraine. It's been building new lines bypassing Ukraine to the north and the south. And to the north, it built Nord Stream with European partners directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Russia and European partners are building a parallel line, Nord Stream 2. And Nord Stream 2 is a hot potato. It's 90% built or more, but Europe is divided on this. The US is going all out to kill it. Recent US sanctions have delayed its completion. Germans are outraged. But now, pipeline opponents are trying to link Navalny's apparent poisoning to Nord Stream 2. And they say, cancel the pipeline, even though it's 90% completed. It's a weird business. Evidence has not been made public. And the question is, cui bono, who benefits? Not Russia. And now Belarus is in our headlines with big protests of election fraud. Why is Belarus so important? It has a strategic location. It's a transit country, again, a transit country for Russian oil and gas to Europe. And it's closely allied to its eastern neighbor, Russia. There's much more to say. The US has imposed a slew of economic sanctions on Russia. Canada has followed suit. And US and NATO troops have advanced to Russian borders. Canada has troops in Latvia and Ukraine. The US alleges Russian interference in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The Russians call the ouster of Ukraine's president 6 years ago a coup. There are two narratives. Our media publish only one. And that leads me to the third form of warfare, psychological operations, or PSYOPs. And what that means is creating disinformation and incidents to stir up emotions and influence opinions. And PSYOPs is a recognized part of military warfare today. Public perception, I rather like this picture, and the underlying reality can be quite different things. PSYOPs are directed against foreign audiences, but they're also against us too. You know, our government does good things, but those other leaders out there, they do bad things. And we've seen a litany of strange incidents that have turned Western governments and mainstream media against one country after another. Election fraud, chemical attacks in Syria, the Skripal poisoning in England, and now Navalny. But the information was always interpretative, no credible evidence. Western governments, including Canada, disparage Russia's RT, Sputnik, and others as state-owned media. But so are CBC, BBC, NPR, Radio Free Europe. Our media echo our government's narratives, whatever they are. We're seeing it now with Venezuela, with Belarus. And governments go after those who shed light on the dark side. Think of Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden. It's a war on us as well as on those other countries. So what do all those conflicts have in common? Power, politics, and I would suggest petroleum too. The countries affected may be petroleum producers or transit countries. They may have but world sea routes, but it's certainly not a savory story. War is an expensive business. It's highly prosperous for some and disastrous for others. And according to Brown University's latest or updated Cost of War project, the US has spent US $6.4 trillion, that's T with a trillion, on wars since 9/11. It's a fortune. And hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions injured, and millions more displaced. I would say it's a disgrace. It's a crime against humanity. Now, since 9/11, Canada has sent troops overseas to Afghanistan, Iraq, Latvia, Libya, Mali, Ukraine. Canada is not at risk of invasion. Who are our troops confronting and why? President Trump, pushes NATO countries to increase military spending to 2% of GDP. And Canada has fallen into line. It's announced major increases. And now we have a global pandemic. And the demands on the public purse for health, for welfare, economic recovery are gigantic. Well, coming to the end, the big game is who's going to control the world? A big question. The US has been a sole power for 30 years, but Russia and China are becoming rivals. And the US is trying to hold them back, and the West is going along, Canada. What we need, in my view, are cooperation and diplomacy, not war. So, I've gone around the world. I've looked at illustrated these three areas of warfare: military, economic, psychological. Has to be quick. I look forward to your questions, and that's my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We are now going to take any questions from the audience. Please type them into the chat box, and I will read them out loud and call on John to answer some of them. So the first question I'll ask you, John, in the chat is, it sounds like moving to a green economy would remove the importance of war. Would you agree? And do you think something else would replace oil as the reason for war?
After petroleum, could another reason come up for war? It seems that human beings can be, when they have power, pretty aggressive. Set of animals, really. I would hope that moving towards green might have that. I think in what I've seen over these last 20 years, and of course the wars extend way back. There's hardly been a period of time since World War II when the US has not been at war. 17 years, I think. It's about power. And so, if petroleum is an instrument of power, whether or not it gets used in one's home country, and so if it's not petroleum, it may be something else. It might be control of the drug trade.
Are there other questions for John at this time? I see Rosemary has asked, what do you suggest we can do to influence a better outcome? That's a big question.
That's a brute of a question, isn't it? I would think that's the question for the organization, but WorldBeyondWar. What do I think? There are all sorts of things that one can do. One can write letters to the newspaper protesting this and that. Well, in my case, I'm giving a talk like this to arouse public consciousness. One can write letters to one's member of parliament. One can make oneself a bit obnoxious by turning up at all candidates' meetings and asking questions, which most people ask about the domestic scene. And I think our newspapers, on the whole, I better not quote a name of one, can be pretty good in discussing on the one hand and on the other hand, and that's what we should do and that's what we shouldn't do in domestic policies, take COVID. But when it comes to foreign policy, I find that newspapers just fall into line with the press releases given to them by D&D, by Global Affairs, by the top ministers, and they need to be called on it.
Absolutely, and we will include after this Q&A, as well as later after our next speaker, a chance for us to actually take a concrete action while we're together on this webinar. So we will come back to that question in just a few moments. We have a question. How did it come about that oil is traded only in US dollars? Was there a time when other currencies were used?
It's a good question. If I can try and answer it in 1 minute flat, that would be rather clever. But basically in about 1970, in the early 1970s, the United States and Saudi Arabia cut a deal whereby the US would guarantee the security of the Saudi leaders, as the House of Saud, if they in turn would give basically to the US a monopoly over the oil trade, and would denominate their sales prices in US dollars, and would only accept payment in US dollars. And with payment, there's an enormous amount of money that had been banked in New York, or quite a bit probably turns up in the city of London. And with that, bit by bit, the other countries in the Gulf, and then Iran and Venezuela, fell into line, and indeed North Sea oil is quoted in US dollars. So that's very much how it came about.
A question here from Sherry. Can you speak to what appears to a layperson's eye to be a glut of oil sitting in tankers during COVID? Would this give an opening for change, do you think?
It's perfectly true. There's around the world with COVID, there's an enormous amount of oil production suddenly finding no market. So what to do with it? So cut back production, but also store that which is produced and how to store it. And so a lot of it got stored in ships around the world. The market fell, obviously. The world oil market consumption fell in the second quarter and the third quarter hugely, starting to pick up, but not as much as had been expected. So now we're again finding oil prices since the last week or two have gone soft again. That could, of course, take one down a huge alley to talk about Trans Mountain and Canadian oil production, but that's basically what happened.
I wonder, in follow-up, if you might want to share a bit more about the Canadian connections around oil. I mean, some of the militarized action that is most visible to me, some of the action of the Canadian military that is most visible to me is in fact the ways the Canadian military is suppressing resistance within Canada itself, especially of Indigenous peoples who are trying to stop pipelines from being built, or trying to stop oil from leaving the ground in Canada or from being exported. I wonder if you want to speak at all to any of what we see within Canada itself of this conflict.
Yes, first there's one thought in my mind, and that's about the sheer defunding war. An absolute fortune is being spent, including in Canada, on warfare, which in my view should be spent on domestic things, health, right now, the COVID, and these other things I mentioned, the economy, welfare. And Canada has no natural enemies. So what on earth is it doing taking part other than appeasing the US, which has its worldwide pretensions? Regarding the oil sands, you know, the production of oil from the oil sands, the development there has been enormous in the last 10 years. The production has doubled. And the question was, where could the oil go? So obviously it went down to the US, but this is because it's mostly bitumen. And the problem with bitumen is that it's guck. In refining, it requires a huge amount of money, first to upgrade it into a decent synthetic crude oil, and then, of course, the usual refining. It is that's quite apart from the environmental problems, on which the next speaker might have something big to say. The only places that can upgrade this crude oil, this bitumen, are Alberta itself, and it doesn't have enough capability to do more than half the oil produced, and the United States, where there are a lot of these refineries that can cope with this stuff, basically by, as I said, selling and undermining the Venezuelan oil that had been going there but is now sanctioned out. Now, Trans Mountain, which currently has regular ordinary light Albertan crude oil goes down it, synthetic crude oil goes down it, ready for refining, and so do products go down it, like gasoline and diesel, for the BC market. The thought of this new pipeline that would run beside it, which is now I see being built even through Kamloops, is that there's a big market waiting for it in Asia. I happen to doubt it. There's an awful lot of oil worldwide, and the Asian refineries, by and large, are not equipped to upgrade it. They don't have the incentive to put in the upgraders. The best thing they can do with this is put it on the roads as asphalt. So we'll see what happens to the pipeline. If it's completed, my view is that it could well be running under capacity or not at all. That's the second one for bitumen.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions at this point, but I was going to say, please join me in giving a round of applause, which I guess people cannot do in a shared way where we can all hear it, but I know emotionally you all join me in thanking John for that really illuminating presentation. You're speaking as someone with so much experience, and experience from the inside of a world that many of us will never see, and the stances and the analysis that you've developed around anti-militarism, around the role of oil in the world is really illuminating. We really appreciate you sharing it with us today.
Can I have one thing? I do have, oh, can I say something more?
Yes, of course.
Yes, on some of these themes, like Canada or the natural gas in Europe, I've written a slew of articles that got published, and they're in my website, which I show is johnfosterwrites.com, and that will get it, and the book.
Excellent. We will send out those links afterwards to everyone who has joined today. Right now, to follow up on one of the questions that was asked and on our promise from earlier, I want to invite everyone to join us in taking one small but still meaningful, concrete action while we're together today. As many of you will know, in 2014, Canada signed the largest arms deal in Canadian history, a deal to sell Saudi Arabia what they call light armored vehicles. Of course, there's nothing light about them, they're tanks. And Saudi Arabia has used these to suppress peaceful protests, and there's mounting evidence that these Canadian-made vehicles are in fact being deployed in the war in Yemen. Of course, Yemen is undisputedly the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now. So a few days ago, World Beyond War joined a coalition with many, many other groups to send a formal letter to Prime Minister Trudeau demanding that Canada stop fueling this conflict and stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. And today was in fact declared a day of action across the country to stop arming Saudi Arabia. There were various in-person and online solidarity actions, including, importantly, at the manufacturing plant in London, Ontario, where these armored vehicles that are being sent to Saudi Arabia are actually built. So in solidarity with this day of action, with the people in Yemen who are in a really a heartbreaking situation right now, I would invite everyone as we speak right now to visit the link that I've just shared in the chat, which is an online tool developed by our allies at Amnesty International Canada, who we've been working with on this campaign. And it will in fact send an email as you click on the button to the Minister of Foreign Affairs demanding that they suspend any arms transfer to Saudi Arabia from Canada. This is a smaller piece of a much bigger puzzle to defund war, ultimately to abolish war is our goal, and to stop Canada from arming these terrible and despicable conflicts. So I will invite everyone right now to click on that link if you'd like, and to send an email to Minister Champagne to amplify the letters, the in-person actions, and everything else that has happened today. In our follow-up email after this event, we will also send you a link that helps you to immediately leave him a voicemail. We're hoping to fill up his voicemail so that his whole office staff, all they will be hearing for a while is messages from people calling for this to be ended. But I won't have people call and leave a voicemail right now. For now, I'll just invite people to click on that link. And I'll give us a minute to do so before I pass it back to Furkan. I see many, many people typing. That's great. The question was, is that only for Canadians? I think it is extra impactful when it's coming from Canadians, but this is a truly global issue, and this is the International Day for Peace. So frankly, I think our foreign minister should be hearing from people all over the world that all eyes are on the Canadian government and that we need to stop exporting these arms immediately. So I think you should go ahead, even if you're not Canadian, is the long answer. All right, I'm seeing some people wrap up. As others continue, perhaps I will pass it back over to Furkan. Thank you so much again, John.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel, and thanks, John. So we're gonna be moving on to our next speaker, Aliénor Rougeot. She's the Toronto coordinator of Fridays for Future, which is a worldwide youth movement in which over 13 million students have joined massive coordinated strikes to demand bold climate action. Born and raised in France, she is a settler in so-called Canada, studying economics and public policy at the University of Toronto. She has been an environmental and human rights activist for a decade and has been passionate about climate justice, specifically since high school. Ali has been recognized for her work by the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace with the Kim Pook Youth Award and Toronto Post magazine in their 20 Under 20. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. Bonsoir tout le monde. This is the only French I'll be using, so don't worry. I'm extremely grateful to have a chance to be with you virtually and to be able to connect with folks that I would never connect with if we were doing this in person. So it's a great opportunity, seeing the bright side of things. I'm also very grateful to come after a knowledgeable speaker like John. I always have to check myself and think, do I know enough to be speaking? But here we are. I apologize in advance. You might see me once in a while glancing back at my screen. I have no notes, I'm cheating, but we are in the middle of organizing a really big climate strike. And if I trust my brain to remember everything in the right order, it might not go well. So this is for the best for all of us. So I'll be speaking tonight more about, climate and climate justice, but it is deeply relevant to the anti-war movement. Obviously, war itself is a huge carbon emitter. I mean, the military, and Rachel speaks to this much better than I can, NATO and the military emit carbon a lot. Obviously, as we saw, fossil fuels in war are deeply intertwined, and so it's relevant as well to speak about defunding fossil fuels. And also the other way around, peace is not possible without resolving this climate crisis. And so it's very interesting that our movements intersect. I'm really glad they are doing that more so now. So climate change is this world that we've heard a lot of in the past few years. And I actually remember this time last year, I would arrive at conferences to speak and I would say, I'm a climate justice activist. And people would roll their eyes, thinking, oh, here we go again. Oh, we've heard this one before. Like, climate was everywhere. And, at that time, it was right before elections, at least in here in Canada. So climate was on our radar. The media was talking about the dangers for Canadians of climate change. Our political leaders were talking about greenhouse gas emissions. Honestly, everybody and their cousin had a solution to this climate crisis at that time. And then, 2020 happened. And even though it's been a year that has had a lot of climate disruption and a lot of fires and floods and typhoons and dams collapsing or almost collapsing because of climate disruption, the term climate change has actually been way less in our, in the media, on our agendas, at least for anybody that's not like in this climate activist bubble. And obviously there's right reasons for that. So we had to deal with the COVID crisis and we couldn't be thinking about everything else. And then in North America, we had the horrible murder of George Floyd, and we had this wave of anti-racism protests that rightfully so caught our eye and caught our attention. But now we're arriving at a moment, and I'm really glad I get to speak right now because this is really the time for countries like Canada and the US. We're arriving at a moment where we're being told that let's try to go back to normal. This was a bad moment in our history. Let's try to go back to normal. And when we're talking about going back to normal, everybody's trying their best not to mention another crisis. Like, you cannot sell anything in 2020 anymore that has the word crisis in it. It's just not possible. But at the same time, I'm watching this thinking, but we're still in very, very big trouble. Don't want to make us all cry or worry here, but there's a lot of things that are not normal or that we don't want in normal. And so giving you a few examples that kind of I thought about earlier today, there's something that we're calling a giga fire on the west of North America. I had never even heard the word giga fire before. It just doesn't sound normal to me, when you see those pictures of the sky. I also saw recently that we are 7 years away from finishing our carbon budget. And the carbon budget is the maximum amount of emissions we can put out before we get to this point of irreversible damage to the earth. 7 years. I will not be 30 in 7 years. So that just feels like very soon. Canada is still way off its Paris targets. The world is way, way off its emissions targets. Right now, the projections we're having with our current emissions is that we will be warming up by approximately 4 or 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. That's absolutely crazy. And so all these facts, that obviously are very scary, and there's a long list of them, really make you think, okay, what are we trying to go back to? There's this really wonderful scientist and woman called Katharine Hayhoe, and she said recently, for a long time as a climate scientist, she was studying the future, and now she turns on TV and the future is now. So this is, when I'm talking about this, I'm not telling you, hey, pay attention to this for your grandchildren. I'm really talking about pay attention to this because the rest of your own life is going to have this climate impact. And that's terrifying, but I guess that's a better reason to listen to what we have to say and to think about this seriously. So now that I've said these horrible things, you might want to turn off your computer. And I guess that's a good thing in person. You couldn't really walk out of the conference room. Here you could just turn off your Zoom and get rid of this child telling you what's happening in the world. But the fight is not over. So a few things I want to kind of have us think about collectively is, how can we work through this issue? The first thing is, let's call it something different. Climate change sounds, it's like a change. Change is good sometimes, change is bad sometimes. Let's not call it climate change anymore. Let's only use words like climate chaos, climate disruption, climate catastrophe. Now, when you say that, there's, it's pretty unambiguous. It's a disaster. And then when you think about it, that was when you talk about it, but when you think about it, you can think about it in another way. Climate change itself can't really be solved. What we can do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We can take the carbon already in the air and suck it back into some natural elements. We can take land and water and make them into carbon sinks again instead of them being carbon emitters. All these things we can do to reach those targets. But climate change itself is not the target. I almost said it's not the enemy, but then I realized we're talking about anti-war, let's use other words. So it's not our target. So what is it? Now I'm just confusing you. I'm telling you the world is a disaster and climate change is not even the problem. What am I trying to tell you? I think when we identify the wrong problem, we are thinking about the wrong solutions. So the solution to this mess is not just a small carbon tax, or even, a small, more plant-based options in the restaurant. Climate change is such a big intersectional problem, just like war is in many ways, that it's going to require a million solutions. And that might scare you at first, but to me, that actually sounds very hopeful, because if there was just one solution, I'd be really unlikely to know that solution to be able to contribute to it. But knowing that there's a million, my chances of actually being able to contribute to one of them is obviously multiplied. That's basic math. And I think we understand the intuition that when you realize there's a lot of ways to contribute, we are included in it. So there's one thing the media loves to ask me, and I wanted to share with you. It's, how do you stay hopeful? How do you think of all these horrible facts and continue to stay cheerful and continue to want to fight climate change? Well, the first thing I answer if I'm feeling a little witty is I say, what choice do I have? I'm a 21-year-old that's born with quite a bit of privilege and born in this world. I really don't have a choice. I kind of have to deal with it. But that's not a really great answer, obviously. So let me tell you why I'm actually hopeful and why I think you can be hopeful too. Climate change is not an all or nothing situation. We're not either going to win this fight or lose it. Every single degree, every single fraction of the degree we manage to prevent is actually going to save lives. That's fantastic. That's groundbreaking news to me, which means if we're only going to rise the temperature to 1.5 degrees instead of 2, we might lose 70% of our coral reef by the end of the century. Now that's horrible, 70% of coral reef, that's absolutely atrocious. But if we rise to 2 degrees, that number goes up to 99% of coral reef. So obviously you see that it's not an all or nothing. Every fraction of the degree matters. And that means every time we can push a little more for climate action, that matters concretely. I find that wonderful. I find that so hopeful. Okay, so solutions to the climate crisis, and why are we still thinking we can do something about it? There's a bunch of solutions, and I think you've probably heard of some. I'd actually love to hear ones more concretely from where you are, or the ones that you care about the most. I like the notion that we have to kind of sober up when it comes to our energy usage. We've talked about all these fossil fuels, and we know that we have renewables and we should be tapping into renewables, but we also have to reduce the energy we use, especially in those wealthier countries where we are. And that doesn't mean you have to turn off your lights all the time. I mean, yes, you should do that, but that's not going to change anything. What we need to be having is free public transit in cities, retrofitting our buildings so that they can waste less energy, reducing the length of this food chain so that we stopped having a lot of transportation in between every part of the manufacturing of our food or of our everything else, of our car, of our planes, of everything we use. We also need to rethink this economic system, right? I'm an economics student, and I just find it fascinating to think, could we have a system that doesn't allow for an outrageous amount of wealth accumulation, and a system that doesn't allow for wealth accumulation to mean political power? We need to rethink that. If you have ideas, I'm wide open on this one. We need to regenerate what we lost. We need to regenerate nature itself. So we need to be replanting, rediversifying. We need to stop taking out everything we want to take out and then dumping back anything we don't want. That's just a childish behavior, and I can't believe we have entire governments doing that. We know we need to be replenishing soils and cleaning up oceans and letting biodiversity come back. But an interesting concept is we actually need to be regenerating our communities. And that's a little harder to think about, but we need to put money in places that need, in human places that need our help. We need to address homelessness and poverty and racism in order to fight climate change. An example is, supporting Black communities in North America to help them heal from all the trauma that's been put onto them. Same with Indigenous folks. Indigenous people need us to help to empower them, to give them the financial means, to give them the land back that they need so that they can heal. Because once we have these communities that heal, we can talk about climate action. You might think, what is the link? I mean, yes, we do want that for these people, but what's the link? Well, the first one is you can't ask people to care about climate change if their basic human rights are not there. That's just not possible. That doesn't work. And then the second, really hopeful one, is that a lot of these communities actually have answers to the climate crisis. Indigenous communities, of course, still have key relationships to the land that we don't have. So that's why I say we have to regenerate those communities too. And notice, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to every example I gave, but notice that in a lot of these different examples, there's jobs there too. That's a fun part of it. Regenerative agriculture, mental and physical health, cleaning up old oil sites, retrofitting buildings, educating future generations. I don't know, I could just keep going. There's a lot of jobs there, right? So that's also awesome, because guess what? We just ended COVID. We need new jobs. We need people to have ways to live in healthy jobs. And so all of this climate plan that we have actually also provides jobs. Wonderful. Okay. So what are we waiting for? Why am I just not doing that by myself? We're actually waiting for you. And I mean, I can't put it more bluntly than we really are waiting for each and every one of us to take in this problem and feel like it's kind of our own problem too. And realizing that we are capable of changing the world. So this is not me telling you to go zero waste or never take your car and just, I don't know, walk your kids to soccer practice at the other side of the city. That's not what I mean. But I mean, unless each and every one of us cares more deeply about this problem as a problem that we can help with, we won't make it. So I have a little exercise with you right now. I can see some of your faces, not all, but I'll try. Just think for a second about who you are. This is not a philosophical question, let me explain. Who you are. Are you a parent? Are you a sibling, a partner, a dog owner, a business owner, a citizen? Think of all the roles you have in life, just for a second. You can write them down if that helps, or you can just kind of think about them. Just thinking about all the roles you hold in your life. Just for a bit. There's probably a lot, some of the fun ones, some are the not fun ones. Now take all these roles and think, which one are the ones that I have the most influence? And that doesn't mean like power in terms of being elected. That means, where are you a trusted voice? So for me, I know that with my roommates, I'm a trusted voice. And with my family, I'm a trusted voice. So you have these roles where you are definitely a very trusted voice, right? Okay, these are the roles you can circle or think about or in your head, like make them clear. These are now the roles. These are these roles that now you have to commit to and think, in these specific positions, how am I going to push for more climate action? That can mean anything in that role. So it can mean showing people's movies, just talking about climate, maybe bringing people to vote, organizing protests, organizing, massive boycotts. The actions are very different depending on what role you chose in your mind. But the reason I propose this exercise is because it's really hard to care all the time, 24 hours, like it's just impossible. And in some of our places, it would be also kind of useless. When I go as a simple individual customer in a huge supermarket, that's not the place where I have the most influence. But when I explain to, my parents who have their own careers and are decision makers in certain places, why I care, that has influence. So I hope this also helped make it more concrete of how we take climate action. And I hope you're committing right now mentally in a few of your key roles to push for climate action. And I said earlier, climate and war were intertwined. War in many ways is obviously the epitome of human failure. It's going to be impossible to have peace, to live without war, if we continue to have climate disruption. And what I meant by that is that we know climate change is going to create more resource scarcity, and that often creates war. And I'm obviously very simplifying here, but it's obviously also going to force migration. And with massive migration, you see racism and xenophobia and hate and conflict, tension, and sometimes war, or sometimes just unrest in general. And there's also so I also know that there's a gendered violence that happens when climate gets rougher and when there's disruption in general and instability. Often a lot of the weight, whatever needs to be done, goes back on the women. Women get back in the household, women have to do. So there's also the gendered component. So when you think of all of these, you think you can't tell yourself you're a peace activist without caring at least a little bit about the climate crisis. And that's just another thing to put in your mind. And I'm not guilting you here. I'm just trying to communicate why I care and why I hope you do too. And before I stop talking, and I'm really looking forward to your questions, I have two shameless plugs to put into here. The first one is that on Wednesday, our government is going to have their speech from the throne. And I'm sure you're looking forward to it to know what kind of decisions they'll be making in terms of military spending, maybe. I don't know if they're going to be announcing any of this. But what I'm looking into is how are they going to propose that we reboost our economy? And that recovery plan that they're going to propose, is it going to be climate friendly at all? Are they going to be bailing out a bunch of big oil companies, or are they going to be investing in something else? And I invite you, if you have the time, to look at the plan too. And if you see that it's not climate friendly, get really angry because this government is working for us normally at all times. And that would be really failing us to not have a green, just recovery in mind. So that's the first one, is on Wednesday, if you have a bit of time, look into what they're spending and get angry if it's not what you were expecting. The second one is Friday. Friday is actually a global day of climate action, which means wherever you are, there's probably an action either online or in person, being mindful of COVID. So make sure they have good COVID safety plans if you're going in person. Where young people are inviting adult allies or inviting everybody to demand climate action and to demand a just recovery. So this Friday on the 25th, you should be looking for which action there is. Ours in Canada is called the Not Going Back campaign, AKA we're not going back to normal. And in Toronto, for example, we're having a big protest, social distanced. But I know in Vancouver, there's gonna be other actions. There's gonna be a lot of actions online. And in general, I think this might be a good way for you to bring a bit of support if you have that time to the climate action and to the youth that are really, trying to guarantee yourselves a somewhat safe future. So just want to conclude with just the idea that now is a great time for what I call organized outrage. it's a great time to realize that we have what it takes to change the system, but it's going to take a lot of courage. It's going to take a lot of generosity with others, and it's going to take you believing that you are an agent of change. I hope I was able to convince you of this a little bit, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ali, for connecting so many dots there. I suspect that many people here felt the urgency of this issue before, but now are seeing different connections between issues of militarism and war and climate justice. And you've given us certainly a lot to think about. I also really appreciate you bringing up the issue of climate grief and sort of the real difficulty of doing this work, that that continuing to be hopeful is a real discipline and a real project, and isn't easy. I would certainly encourage people to include questions in the chat. I saw that there was already some comments about how what you had written about baby steps is a truly wonderful strategy for manifesting hope. Maybe while we wait for others, I'll throw in a first question. I think many people have noticed various reports or headlines, although like you said, there has not been that much on climate change during COVID, but one that I have seen is pointing out how, despite the fact that nobody is flying, very few people are flying, very few people are driving, workplaces are shut down, the drop in emissions has been just a few percentage points. And I think for many people who have been told, what we need to do is change our light bulbs and drive less, and that's what solves the climate crisis, it's very confusing and very disappointing right now. So I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, because that was very disheartening for all of us. We thought, we are not using our cars, we're not doing anything. And it's still, we lost maybe 17% at the best time of our emissions. And I think that really goes to show why when I say, oh, it's up to everybody to act, it's not up to everybody to act in their own home. It's really up to everybody to act as part of a system, as part of the system. It's what these numbers show us is that at all times, because industry is emitting, because we have even, we saw it with those, someone mentioned the crude oil barrels just staying there. We're still kind of constantly on this baseline of emissions that's way past what we all see in our everyday lives. And so, I don't know, once again, I think I really see it as a source of hope, because it's not all onto you, and it's not to you to live your perfect life, carbon neutral life. But it's really up to us to just change the actual baseline of where we are. Our resting state should be carbon neutral and not already so high. But yeah, without going into too much details, the reason why all of these were not, our emissions weren't like close to zero during COVID was really because a lot of industries were still working. We were continuing to extract. When we extract, we do still have emissions. We were still overproducing and probably overconsuming or wasting. And then, things I mentioned very quickly, carbon sinks and carbon emitters. One fact that you might not know is that a lot of our soil is normally a carbon sink, right? The soil just takes back some of the carbon in the air. But because of agriculture, intensive agriculture, now a lot of our soil is a net emitter. So it just emits more than it takes back. So these things, no matter how much you use the land or not, they just keep going. Yeah, I don't know if that answers any of what you asked, but a few fun facts.
Absolutely. I think I think, like you said, many people are realizing that, of course, our individual actions have impact, but maybe not in all the simple ways that we've been told. It's not just about, our light bulbs in our cars and so forth. I see people are sending me questions privately. Feel free to post them in the chat for everyone, but I'll address some of the ones people are sending from me to ask you. So there's a question about, can you speak about your work with allies? So what kinds of groups or working together on various tactics or solidarity projects are you and Fridays for Future involved in?
Yeah, that's a great question. in general, a lot of the work we do is mostly in partnerships. We really have been working at being better, at working with the labor movement, because obviously they're very powerful organizers. And because we need this recovery to also be providing safe jobs and good jobs for all people, for all Canadians, we've been trying to work more with labor movement. We go to speak at their events. We invite them to speak at ours. We try to co-design letters or events in general. During the anti-racism protests, we obviously showed up, and we would get our supporters to show up for the reasons that I mentioned. Obviously, during Indigenous protests, it's very important for us to show up because as settlers, we also owe a lot to Indigenous activists in terms of environmental activism. And then we do sometimes work more sporadically with other groups, especially if they come to us and have an idea. So for example, we would do groups with LGBTQ plus communities that have a specific project that we could co-work together around mobilizing. We've done work before with a few anti-war movements for peace. Last year on September 21st, there's a peace walk around Toronto, and we participated, kind of putting those links between climate and peace. So we try to do a lot. We're a youth organization, so every new idea you have is wonderful because we kind of add that to the idea bank that we have. But yeah, these are some of the partnerships we've been doing.
So I see there's a few questions kind of going back to the idea of individual actions. Teresa has asked, what do you think are the 3 most important changes that individuals can make in their own lives to reduce?
Yeah. So definitely to reduce your own, I do think there's some that you're going to adapt that to your case. I know for me as a student, the way I ate was very different. So for me was vegan, but it can be vegetarian, or reducing your meat intake and your dairy intakes will have an impact. However, if that's not possible, or really not something you see yourself doing, definitely changing vehicles or changing the way you commute is huge. Sometimes, and this sounds very crazy, but the size of your house has a huge impact on the energy you use. Now, you might not be able to move, but it could be something you have in mind if you get to move, obviously. Big houses just consume more. That's the way it is. For some of us maybe that are more into fashion or things like that, fashion has a huge carbon footprint. So going back to what my grandmother used to do, which was just having clothes that would just last very, very like decades, and not just changing them constantly, is a big one. But I do think diet and transport are big if you want to reduce your individual one. But your individual action can be system oriented. So your individual action can be every day calling your MP and reminding them that you want a just transition from COVID. They will hate you, but that will be a very powerful individual action you'll be taking.
So we're out of time for questions right now. So I want to thank you again, Ali. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Tamara Lawrence, who is an activist, an academic, a expert, and someone many of us deeply admire for her work around climate justice, as well as anti-militarism and weapons. And she will be introducing the next action that we hope all of you will join us in taking while on this webinar. So thank you again, Ali, and now I will pass it to Tamara.
Hello, everyone. Happy International Peace Day. It's so nice to be with you all. So I'm in Waterloo on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. I want to say how impressed and inspired I am by listening to John and Ali. Their presentations were excellent. One of the reasons, of course, why our emissions aren't going down is because the wars and the war games are still going on. So as somebody pointed out, but I just want to reiterate, Canada has battle groups in Eastern Europe. We have warships in the Mediterranean and in the Pacific. We have fighter jets right now that are patrolling up the up along the border of Russia in Eastern Europe right now. So we definitely need to demilitarize, to decarbonize. I'm wearing my pink hat. This is the hat that I wore today for the protest that we had at the Waterloo Public Square, Stop Arming Saudi Arabia. And I can see Dwyer and Mary are on the call right now, and they were with me at the square with our sign, Stop Arming Saudi Arabia, Yemen can't wait, we need to export peace. And so I know some of you were participating in actions like this across the country, so we were in solidarity with you. We absolutely need conversion to a peace green economy. So I want to tell you very quickly about our next fantastic action that we hope that you'll participate in. It's going to be Friday, October 2nd. It's an action to stop the Trudeau government from buying 88 new fighter jets with $19 billion of our precious tax dollars. So what we're hoping all of you will do is to stand in front of your member of parliament with a sign, no new fighter jets, and to deliver a letter and to take a picture with your signs and then send it to us. If you contact Rachel, she will be able to give you the toolkit, the letter, the handout, graphics for the sign. That will be all ready this week, so you'll be completely prepared by October 2nd. We had our first International Day, our first Pan-Canadian Day of Action in July. We had 22 actions across the country, and this time on October 2nd we want to have double that. We want to have about 50 actions. So we hope that you can participate. The Canadian government has not yet decided which fighter jet it will pick. We have time, folks, to stop it. If we work together, we can stop the Canadian government from buying these carbon-intensive combat aircraft. Just think of them as pipelines in the sky. They are so bad, so destructive for the atmosphere, so destructive for the climate, and they're so destructive to people. We need to stop the wars to stop global warming. So we hope that you'll participate. There'll be more information on the World Beyond War website, and also the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and many other partners across the country are involved. And you can find out more information on the VOW website, vowpeace.org/no fighter jets. So we hope that you can participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. But the last step is the thing that you can do right now, which is before October 2nd. Right now, we would invite you to click on the link in the chat, which as you click it right now, will send an email to the Canadian government, to your MP. You can also do this if you don't live in Canada, but especially if you do live in Canada, you should do this. It'll email your MP, it'll email Trudeau, it'll email the opposition party leaders, saying that you demand exactly what Ellie said, a green and just recovery, and that the Canadian government should in no way spend $19 billion of that recovery funds to buy fighter jets to bomb the rest of the world. So please click on the link right now in the chat. And the good news is if you do that, then we will also flag you as someone who we should send info about the October 2nd Day of Action too. So then I'll send you kind of a follow-up email saying, thank you for emailing Trudeau. Now would you like to join us on October 2nd as well? Hoping the link is working for folks. I'm seeing people clicking. I'll give us all just another minute to do that right now before I pass it back over to Furkan. All right, I know everyone's not quite done, but maybe we'll pass it over. Thank you again, Tamara, for that amazing speech and rallying call to take all of these actions.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, thanks, Tamara and Ali. It was really inspiring information, and looking forward to taking part of this fight or direct action. Our next speaker joining us next is Vancouver Peace Poppies co-founder Teresa Gagne, and I'd like to welcome Teresa to talk about the Vancouver Peace Poppies.
Hi. Being the International Day of Peace, it seems like a good occasion to talk about Peace Poppies and our White Poppy campaign. I know many people in Canada, it's a new idea, but in fact, it's actually a very old idea. In Britain, the idea of decoupling November 11th and the red poppy from their military culture dates back to 1926. At that time, a member of the No More War movement suggested that the British Legion should be asked to imprint No More War in the center of red poppies instead of Hague Fund. And failing this, pacifists should make their own flowers. A few years later, the idea was again discussed by the Cooperative Women's Guild, who in 1933 produced the first white lapel poppies to be worn on Armistice Day, later called Remembrance Day. The Guild stressed that the white poppy was not intended as an insult to those who had died in the First World War, a war in which many of the women had lost husbands, brothers, sons, and lovers. The following year, the newly founded Peace Pledge Union joined the CWG in distributing the poppies and later took over their annual promotion. My partner Denis and I got our first white poppies in Vancouver about 20 years ago from members of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We were immediately taken with the idea and started making and wearing them each November. People were curious, and many meaningful conversations with strangers started with, "What's the white poppy for?" That interest made us feel that they should be more widely available. So in the fall of 2008, we started with 50 handmade white poppies. The following year, we launched Vancouver Peace Poppies with 500 cloth poppies imported from the Peace Pledge Union in Britain. The response has been beyond our expectations. Last year, our 12th campaign, we distributed over 5,500 white poppies to 49 communities across Canada. Our website, peapoppies.ca, you'll find background information, order forms, testimonials, posters and templates for do-it-yourselfers, and a host of educational resources for schools. Our goal at Vancouver Peace Poppies is to encourage Canadians to broaden their Remembrance Day focus to include the civilians who now make up 90% of conflict victims, to challenge the beliefs, values, and institutions that make war seem inevitable, and to urge our government to promote and fund effective non-military means of dispute resolution. Traditional Remembrance Day activities have focused on honoring the valor and sacrifice of Canadian military combatants in past and current conflicts. But since the first Armistice Day ceremony in 1919, the world has seen hundreds of wars and the resulting deaths of more than 200 million people, most of them civilians. Through mail order, and you can order a minimum of 10 or a maximum of 100 poppies, which come with colorful information cards. So I'm just going to hold one up here to the upside. No, and also safety pins. So unlike the red ones, you won't be littering the sidewalk with them. They're also durable, made out of cloth, and you can reuse them for several years. We run our campaign as a consciousness raiser, not a fundraiser. Importing poppies from Britain costs us about 90 to 95 cents a poppy, and additional campaign expenses and printing and postage bring that total to about $1.25 a poppy. The suggested donation of $1 to $2 covers our costs and lets us provide subsidized poppies to schools and free poppies to disadvantaged communities. We're very proud with the success of our schools campaign. We offer all kinds of resource material for students and teachers to use. And the response has been really good. Last year, we distributed over 1,600 poppies to schools in Canada. For the last 4 years, we've also hosted Let Peace Be There Memorial, a Remembrance Day wreath-laying ceremony for civilian victims of war. Last year, about 275 people attended this moving commemoration in Vancouver's Seaforth Peace Park. And you may be surprised to hear, but the event has been very well received. It's been supported and sanctioned by the City of Vancouver, city officials laying a wreath, and it's attracted no negative publicity. So I would really encourage other people to consider launching something like that in your community. Unfortunately, due to COVID, this year's campaign or ceremony has had to be canceled, but we're hoping to resume again next year. So I just wanted to kind of let people know that this is something that's out there, that's something that we can do as individuals to show our commitment to a better, more peaceful world. So if you're interested, check out our website, peacepoppies.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. So with that, I want to thank all the speakers at today's event, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Feel free to get involved in your local World Beyond War chapter, or if there is not one, to start one. The link was posted earlier. And also a reminder to sign the Peace Pledge if you have not. Note that today's event is supporting the work towards a resolution to divest from fossil fuels and weapons. And this will be presented in the Township of Langley and City Council. And we're hoping to do that in the month of October. This is one of our chapter's campaigns, and we're hoping to expand it to the other cities in the Vancouver region. And if anybody's interested in getting involved in this, please reach out. And finally, I also invite you to donate to the Vancouver area chapter of World Beyond War to help us continue our work. You can do so by e-transfers, which can be sent to Vancouver@WorldBeyondWar.org. And you can just set the password to Peace 2020. And a follow-up email will be sent to all the participants with all the key links and a link to the recording for the webinar. And once again, thank you and good night to everybody.